Hello, United Methodist Men of the North Georgia Conference. My name is Odo Horn, and I'm the president of the North Georgia Conference United Methodist Men. And I want to welcome you to this conversation that I will be having with Dr. David deSilva of Ashland Theological Seminary and Ohio. And we're going to have a conversation about the Apocrypha, specifically the time period of Alexander the Great thereafter. Some of you didn't know that Alexander the Great was in the Bible, and that's what we're going to learn today. Dr. deSilva, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Odell. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dr. deSilva, I'm looking, you are the trustee's distinguished professor of New Testament at Greek at Ashland Theological Seminary. Tell me what that is and tell me where you got your degrees and what do you do specifically?
Very good. So I teach courses relevant to Second Temple period Judaism and New Testament studies. And I also teach Greek language about every other year. I have come up through the ordination process in the United Methodist Church in the Florida Conference. But I got my education first at Princeton Seminary for my MDiv, and then Emory University for my PhD, which is actually where I took all the Methodist courses that are required of ordinands and what have you. So I've been teaching for 27 years and have been ordained just as long. If you want more, you'll have to ask more.
No problem. First, tell me what, you've been, let me say this, you've been, all 27 years have been at Ashland Seminary?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Like a tree planted.
And then tell me about you mentioned Second Temple Judaism.
Sure.
What that is.
So about half of the work I've done, maybe a little less, has been in Jewish literature written between about 300 BC and 100 AD. So I've become somewhat of an expert in the Apocrypha. And then maybe more time I spend in the New Testament, particularly the back half, the letters of Paul, letters to the Hebrews, and also the book of Revelation have been areas of specialization over the years.
Okay. We're going to get into that, but tell us a little bit more about yourself. Where were you born? Just give us the basics, as though this was a good Southern conversation. We were sitting on the front porch in a rocking chair drinking some lemonade.
Well, I was born the son of a pharmacology major and a botany major in New Jersey. My father comes from Sri Lanka. He was born there and lived there through college and came to America to do his graduate work, which is where he met my mother. And I spent the first 24 years of my life in New Jersey, which is where they resided. I actually grew up Episcopalian and loved it. Fabulous liturgy, fabulous hymnody. So a lot of my own kind of spiritual roots and my own sense of what nurtures me spiritually is frankly more Episcopal than Methodist. I hope you won't therefore cancel me. I took I fell in love with church music early in my life and became an organist for a church by the time I was 18. So part of my, I'd say the lion's share of my work in the church has been as a music minister, as a choir director and organist, which has kept me rooted in the life of local congregations since college. When I finished seminary, I met my wife to be. We got married in 1990. Donna Jean is actually from Florida. So we met down here in Florida when I was visiting my grandparents, who, like everybody's grandparents, retired down here. And we've been married for 31 years and have 3 sons together. They're 26, 23, and 21. And the middle one is actually getting married in 2 weeks. So yeah, they're out of the nest and starting to feather their own nests.
Okay, all right. Congratulations. That's good. That's good. Let's get into this conversation then about the Apocrypha. Tell us, first of all, what most Methodists know is that the Apocrypha is this book in between the Old Testament and New Testament. Tell us more specifically what the Apocrypha is.
Well, sure. Actually, Methodists are in a much better place to be acquainted with the Apocrypha these days, since the Common English Bible featured also a fresh translation of the Apocrypha, along with everything else. And in that collection, I think 18 texts were included. A variety of different kinds of literature. Some are historical books, First and Second Maccabees, which are very important to the topic that we'll be talking about a little bit later. Some are collections of wisdom literature, like the Wisdom of Ben Sira, written in about 200 BC to 180 BC in Jerusalem itself. So a wonderful sort of window into what a sage was teaching his students in Jerusalem 2 centuries before Jesus' ministry. And then the Wisdom of Solomon, written by a Greek-speaking Jew in the diaspora, probably somewhere in an Egyptian Jewish community. There are several liturgical pieces like our Psalms that show up. For example, the penitential prayer of Manasseh, or the 2 liturgical pieces that are inserted into the fatter version of Daniel that was circulated among Greek-speaking Jews. We've got the Prayer of Azariah, another wonderful penitential psalm, and then the Song of the 3 Young Men, a lavish hymn of praise. There are anti-idolatry polemics, like the Letter of Jeremiah, helping diaspora Jews not be taken in by the religious charlatanry all around them, from the author's perspective. There's an apocalypse called Second Esdras, which is really a combination of 3 different texts, the heart of which is a Jewish apocalypse written after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, giving us a window into how a pious, Torah-committed Jew was making sense of and thinking about how to rebuild Judaism after that traumatic end to the First Revolt. So kind of a long line of interesting windows into how Judaism was developing, how its ethics and its theology and its hopes were taking shape in this period, say the 2 centuries before the birth of Jesus, and going a full century then into the Common Era. Oh, and I should just say, for anyone who's hesitant, these are not demonic books to avoid. Not many people still have that prejudice, but when I was young, there were still people in church like, oh, we shouldn't be reading those. Those were banned from the Bible. It's like, no, they weren't banned. Protestants just stopped considering them canonical, but they value them enough to keep translating and printing them. I mean, Martin Luther, the reformer par excellence, thought so much of him, he spent months translating him into German and printed them between the testaments. In fact, he gave them this glowing endorsement: these books are good and useful to read. I would love to have an endorsement like that from Martin Luther on any of my books. So we don't need to be hesitant about approaching these books. They are at the very least vital historical and theological documents, letting us know what Judaism was becoming in the centuries before the Word became flesh. And that's my
Thank
pitch.
you. No problem. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. First Maccabees is one of my favorite books of the Bible. But you have worked on not only Common English Bible, but you worked on the Apocryphal version and the English Standard Version?
Yeah, yeah, I was Apocrypha editor for the Common English Bible. The ESV took a lower budget approach and just got a task force of 4 people together to do the work to kind of update the Revised Standard Version for an ESV Apocrypha. Yeah. So any opportunity I've had to promote the visibility and accessibility of the Apocrypha, I've jumped at.
Okay. Okay. Well, tell us then, because once I read First Maccabees, I was like, oh, this is some good, rich stuff. So tell us about the Apocrypha. Tell us what you're going to be talking to us about today.
Sure. Well, really, I'm not going to take us through the books of the Apocrypha so much today, but rather try to lay out briefly the historical background against which many of these books were written, but not the Apocryphal books only. In fact, you mentioned First Maccabees being a book that you really appreciate. Martin Luther also did. He gave special kudos to Wisdom of Solomon and First Maccabees, and he said First Maccabees is almost worthy of being scripture. And he said it's most necessary to understand scripture, especially the book of Daniel. So the book of Daniel is another place where we could kind of anchor today's conversation, because chapters 7 through 11 of the book of Daniel really focus on this period of history, from the rise of Alexander the Great, from about 334 when he began his eastward conquests, through the breakup of Alexander's empire under his successors, coming all the way down to a truly watershed moment, a traumatic watershed moment in Jewish history, which many of us refer to as the Hellenization Crisis, which is a series of events that happened between about 172 and 165 BC that almost snuffed out Judaism in Judea. Were it not for, and this will be our third movement, the Maccabean Revolt, the popular uprising led by a family of rural priests who restored, unbelievably, an independent Jewish state for the first time in 400 years. And then, of course, the fourth movement would be the dynasty that was founded by that family, the Hasmonean Dynasty, which is pretty much dated from 141 BC to 63 BC, when Israel was an independent nation in between a string of foreign dominations. And of course, the end of the Hasmonean Dynasty story is the coming of Rome, and Rome's ending that dynasty and making of Judea a Roman province, first ruled through the Herods and then directly. So I'm hoping in 30 minutes to take us kind of through that. And for those of you who might want to hit the pause button, because that's what we can do now, that nothing is live. If you hit the pause button and read Daniel 8 before you go on, that is just a place to anchor this discussion in Scripture. And Daniel 8 itself tells us that this is all about the rise of the king of Greece, of Alexander, and his defeat of the Persian Empire and his extension of a Greek empire in its stead. So maybe with that, I should just go into the story.
Well, let me just sum this up for
Okay.
United Methodist men. We've been talking about the Apocrypha, but we're really talking about the Hellenist period that sort of just, I don't know if it's coincides with the Apocrypha or is unified with it, but this is the introduction of the Greek period into Judaism and how this would then later go on and influence the New Testament. Would that be a correct?
That's excellent, Odell.
Okay. With that said, I'm going to let you tell us about the spread of Hellenism under Alexander the Great.
So round about 350 BC, everything from Egypt and Turkey all the way east to the easternmost part of what is today Iran was part of the Persian Empire. It was one of the first just major world empires on the stage. It dwarfed the Babylonian Empire that had come before it. And the Persian Empire just made the terrible mistake of getting way too close to Macedon and Greece. When the Persian king crossed the Hellespont, that narrow land bridge that connects Turkey and Greece, and annexed all of what was then Thrace, he invited hell upon his head. Philip III of Macedon, who's Alexander the Great's father, united Macedonia and the city-states of Greece and really set the stage for all that his son Alexander would do. And Alexander set out with these unified Greek forces as the liberator of all the Greek colonists and the Greek cities that had fallen under Persian rule. So around about 334, this young man of 23 sets out at the head of the army and pushes the Persian forces back out of Europe and out of most of Turkey. King Darius III just cannot seem to stand up to him and keeps getting pushed back. When Alexander has recovered all of what is now Turkey, he set his sights south and continued to destroy Persian power and replace it with his own power, all through Syria, Israel, Egypt, and then, having accomplished all of that in a mere 2 years, returned to a position in easternmost Turkey, fought Darius's army again, defeated him again, and sent him fleeing to the eastern parts of his own empire, where he would eventually be killed by his own lieutenants. And Alexander just never stopped. There just wasn't a border that seemed far enough east to suit him. So he took his army all the way to the Indus River, all the way to the easternmost part of Iran and a bit further, and unified all of it, however briefly, under Greek hegemony. And he did this in these 4 short, well, let's expand that to 6 short years, by planting Greek colonies throughout the area that he had covered. And each of these Greek colonies was in effect a replica of Athens with a Greek constitution. And one of his kind of genius moves was to invite local elites into the roles of citizens, the citizen roles of these cities, and expose them to Greek education and really seek to be their, to say partner would be too innocuous, but to involve them in his rule of their area, of their regions. So he was the opposite of xenophobic. He really wanted to blend his armies with local elite cultures and create a unified empire, a culturally unified empire, in the course of which, however, he also spread Greek culture, Greek philosophy throughout this region, not himself personally, of course, but as a result of this blending and the massive movements of population that would be facilitated because this was all united under Greek rule. Alexander, however, died at the age of 33 without a viable heir. He had one living son, but that poor son didn't stand a chance against the 4 generals that Alexander left behind, each of whom wanted his piece of empire. And this is also something you'll encounter throughout Daniel 7 through 11, this splintering of the great kingdom of the Greeks into 4 parts. And these 4 parts are the kingdom of the Ptolemies in Egypt, the kingdom of the Seleucids in Syria and Babylon, the kingdom of Antigonus, and the kingdom of Lysimachus in Asia Minor and Greece proper. And so these 4 kind of minor kings all began to war against one another, seeking to get the largest piece of Alexander's empire they could. However, even though the empire was divided into 4, it was still fairly culturally unified. So the spread of Greek language, Greek literature, Greek culture, continuing to invite local elites to participate in this infusing, this blending of cultures, continued throughout the lands that the successors of Alexander ruled. Now, coming down to Judea and the territory that is of most interest to those of us who are only interested in this history because of our attachments to Scripture, it's really just 2 of these successor empires that matter. It's the Seleucid Empire in Syria and the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. For the first 100 years after Alexander's death, the Ptolemies included Palestine as part of their empire. And this was a fairly innocuous sort of rule as far as most Judeans were concerned. As long as tribute was paid, the Jews were permitted to govern themselves by their own laws, observe their own religious customs, and what have you, very much as under Persian rule. Round about 200 BC, the Seleucid emperor of the time, Antiochus III, successfully defeated the Ptolemy, whose number escapes me at the moment, but who was reigning at the time, and won the whole territory of Palestine for his empire. Antiochus III intended to carry on the very tolerant rule that the Ptolemies had exercised over Judea. And so all would have continued just fine, except something began to happen among the Jerusalem elite round about 175 BC. And here we come to the second movement of this story, what would come to be known as the Hellenization Crisis. The elites of Jerusalem began to realize that if they were to be part of these international empires, if they were to put their city on the international map and have a role on that stage, they needed to become more Greek and less Jewish. They needed to leave behind the sort of indigenous identity that they had been clinging to, which we would otherwise call faithfulness to the covenant of Moses. And so this moved in stages. And the first stage happened when a pious high priest named Onias lost his position to his younger Hellenizing brother, who was given the name Yeshua, but took the name Jason, famous Greek hero. That tells you all you need to know about this man. He was willing to leave behind a lot of his Jewish heritage and remake himself and remake Jerusalem after the image of the Greeks. Now, he didn't mess with the religious rites in the temple, but he did set aside the law of Moses as the civil law and instead rearranged Jerusalem under a Greek constitution, with all of the institutions that a Greek city would have: a gymnasium, which was kind of both an athletic and an educational facility for the youth of the elite, a body of citizens who thought like he did, progressive-minded, Hellenizing Jewish citizens who would become really the new power brokers for Jerusalem. And he wanted to start putting Jerusalem on the international map in this way. This wasn't so terrible because no one's ability to follow the law of Moses was hindered. Nothing in the temple service changed. Didn't mess with the worship service. We all know how important that is. This was all much more in the sort of political and cultural scene and fairly limited to the elites. But it wasn't enough for some other Hellenizing Jews. And so a rival party rose up, ousted Jason, and got Antiochus IV to appoint a different high priest, whose name comes to us only as Menelaus. Again, a very Greek epic name on a Jewish high priest. And under Menelaus, things just really went downhill fast. Each of these changes of high priests was effectively the result of bribing the king, Antiochus IV, to make a political change. And so the elite Jews basically bid themselves to a place where they could not keep up with the payments that were due to their Seleucid overlord. And so they had to start raiding the temple treasury to pay the tributes. And Antiochus IV, when they were behind, showed up and raided the temple treasury when they were in arrears. And of course, you can imagine the temple, the most sacred space on the planet for the pious Jew, becoming sort of a personal bank of Antiochus IV and his Jewish collaborators, really aroused a lot of opposition, which came to a head when Antiochus went to Egypt with his army, having passed through Judea and having visited the temple for a withdrawal.
Is this the one that they call Epiphanes?
Yes, thank you. Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that says a lot about him too. His throne name essentially presents him as a god in the flesh, a manifestation of a deity. So we're dealing with someone with a very healthy ego, one who will not be crossed. So on his campaign to Egypt, his attempts to actually take over the Ptolemaic Empire for himself, a rumor goes out that he got killed in battle, and Jerusalem is in rebellion against his rule and against his puppet Menelaus. Antiochus hears about this rebellion to his rear, returns from Egypt with great anger, and institutes a series of repressive measures against the population of Jerusalem. And somehow, and I'm fairly sure Menelaus had something to do with this, he comes up with the idea that if there's ever going to be a peaceful transition to a Hellenized Jerusalem, devotion to the Mosaic law has to be stamped out. And so this puts the crisis in Hellenization crisis. Circumcising your male children, possessing copies of the scrolls of the law, observing the dietary regulations of law, observing the Sabbath, all these things become illegal and punishable by death. And as First Maccabees puts it very tersely, and they did die, because many Jews were more willing to suffer horribly on the way to execution rather than break faith with the covenant and with their God. To the point that there are some stories, some dramatic stories of martyrdoms that are passed down in Second Maccabees and Fourth Maccabees about this very thing, how a group of Jews offer their lives to God on behalf of the people, dying under torture rather than eating a mouthful of pork as a symbol of their willingness to renounce the Jewish way of life. This arouses a great deal of reawakened zeal for the covenant. And it also arouses, and here we come to the third movement of the story, all-out revolution.
Let me
yes,
interrupt you right there. So right before we get to the third movement, which is the rebellion, the major players are the Ptolemies, the General Ptolemy, Alexander the Great. He dies. The two major players during this time period is General Ptolemy, who's Egypt, and Israel or Judea at that time.
And then Seleucus is the founder of the Seleucid Empire.
Seleucid Empire.
And that would be Syria and Babylon.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And their descendants go on for 200 years, almost 150 years before we get to this critical moment.
And then we can't, this Antiochus IV Epiphanes is a major player, at least in the book of First Maccabees.
Yes. And I would say Daniel. Antiochus IV is the one who fits the profile of that little horn who speaks great blasphemies, and that particular king of the north who moves against the beautiful land. And this, in fact, this is the moment that we're coming to. He not only proscribes Jewish practice, he plants a garrison of foreign soldiers beside the temple, and he orders the rededication of the Jerusalem temple in a way that will suit the multinational population of the New Jerusalem here. And so we get what is referred to as the Abomination of Desolation in the book of Daniel, the introduction of pagan deities and pagan rituals into the Jerusalem temple, which renders the temple unusable for pious Jews. It's been, in effect, co-opted by the Hellenizing Jews and their Syrian military supporters who have been planted in the city. It's against all of this that a man named Mattathias rises up against. Mattathias is a priest who isn't resident in Jerusalem. He's one of those part of those priestly families that live throughout Judea and are occasionally on duty at the temple. And Mattathias has 5 strapping sons, the most famous of which is Judas, who comes to be known as Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer. Mattathias and his 5 sons gather to themselves a guerrilla band of people who are zealous for the law, zealous for the covenant. And they go about terrorizing the Hellenizing Jews who haven't circumcised their young. They circumcise their boys for them. I'm sure that would have been better done professionally. And they begin to attack outposts of the Syrian king, the Syrian army. And not to go into too much detail, they continue to grow because of their successes, successes that they have, historians are convinced, because Antiochus IV and his underlings continually underestimated them. And so they kept sending inadequate forces to deal with this revolutionary movement. And every success that Judas, because Mattathias dies quite early, Judas and his brothers have, draws more supporters to them from among the ranks of pious Jews. And so their ranks swell, and they continue to outnumber whatever forces the Syrians send to them, to the point that Judas is able to take back the temple and cleanse it of the pollutions that have been introduced, rebuild a clean altar, and reinstitute the proper worship of the one God there. This is, of course, celebrated every year since in the Feast of Hanukkah, a feast that shows up in the Gospel of John as the Feast of Dedication. Judas himself will die in battle, but his brothers carry on the fight, especially Jonathan and Simon. And a wonderful thing for Judea happens. After Antiochus IV died, there is not a clear successor for the rest of the Seleucid Empire. Instead, there is an endless line of rival claimants. So the Seleucid Empire is always engaged in civil war from about 164 BC to its demise when Rome takes it over in the 70s. So the weakness now of the Seleucid Empire to the north allows Jonathan and Simon to gain rights for the people of Judea by making treaties with the various claimants who try to outbid each other to get first Jonathan and then Simon as their ally. And before you know it, here we come to the close of the third movement. Simon, the last surviving brother of Judas, is granted limited political independence. He is made the ethnarch and the high priest, and coins are minted in the first year of the reign of Simon, as opposed to according to Seleucid kings' dates. So what begins as a revolt against religious persecution ends in the establishment of a politically independent Judea in 141 BC for the first time since 597 BC. So this is an almost unprecedented win, as it were, for the Jewish people since Nebuchadnezzar first rolled through in the early 6th century. So the fourth movement is the story of Simon's descendants, the Hasmonean kings, the Hasmonean Dynasty. And Simon reigned for a good long while, and he left his son, John Hyrcanus I, as his successor. And it seemed to have been a very smooth succession, and both as high priest and as ethnarch. They did not yet take the title of king. And under John Hyrcanus, these Judean kings begin a policy of expansion. Jonathan and Simon, truth be told, began to expand a bit too, but John Hyrcanus really pushes the borders of his territory far to the south and far to the north. He takes Lower Galilee, he takes Idumea, and he takes Samaria. And his oldest son, Aristobulus, succeeds him, but he only lives for a year, so not much happens. But Aristobulus's brother, Alexander Jannaeus, continues this expansionist movement. And it's under Alexander Jannaeus that the Hasmoneans come to rule a territory just about as large as the territory of Solomon was back in the the glory days of Israel's history. That appears to have been the family's aim all along. They didn't seek to take territory that had never belonged to Israel. They did seek to retake all the territory that historically God had granted to this people. And under Alexander Jannaeus, they succeeded.
Now, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned Idumea. I also believe you mentioned Samaria. And tell us geographically where that is.
Sure. I should have brought a PowerPoint. Odell, I have failed the United Methodist Men of the North Georgia Conference. Man. But if you'll turn to the back of your study Bible, you'll find a map. Judea is sort of the central heartland of the southern part of Israel. And then Samaria is a territory to the northwest of that. Idumea is a territory to the south and somewhat southeast of that. Galilee, of course, then would be even further north than Samaria. So all of that has been taken afresh for the Jewish dynasty of the Hasmonean family. All right. However, the Hasmoneans are the family was a better family of revolutionaries than they were a family of rulers, shall we say. And so in that generation of the Maccabean Revolt, there's really not a lot that can be said ill of these leaders. Conversely, once they establish their dynasty, there is a lot that can be said that they did amiss. So, for example, Alexander Jannaeus is remembered for brutally suppressing his critics and rivals. It is under him, in fact, his personal order, that 800 men who were part of a rival faction are crucified while he has their wives and children slaughtered before their eyes. This is, as one of the Dead Sea Scrolls put it, a thing that had not been done before in Israel. And so just sort of the brutality against their own co-religionists really erodes a great deal of support for the dynasty. Alexander Jannaeus dies in about 87 BC, leaves his kingdom to his wife, Salome Alexandra. This is the first time in forever that a woman has been in charge of Israel. I think before this, you have to go back to Athaliah, and that didn't work out so well. But Salome Alexandra was, by all reports, a model ruler, probably the best of the Hasmonean rulers in terms of the peace she was able to make with her subjects and maintain for her subjects. But unfortunately, after that decade of a golden age, her two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, dragged Israel down in a civil war because the younger son would not allow the older son to rule. And so the country was just torn apart, and they made this terrible mistake of inviting the Romans to intervene in their civil struggle, which the Romans did. They moved in and basically ensured quite violently the future peace of the kingdom, which would no longer be a kingdom. In the end, Hyrcanus II was allowed to be high priest, but not king any longer. And Roman domination really began in 63 with very close Roman oversight through Rome's appointees, Antipater, the father of Herod the Great, and finally Herod the Great. But that takes us beyond today's story. I did want to just point out for for our United Methodist men who are tuning in, ways in which this story impacts Judaism and impacts Jewish consciousness in ways that are relevant for us who really care more about the New Testament than we care about the Apocrypha. I realize there are a few out there for whom that might be true. And so let me start with just the Hellenization of the entire Eastern Mediterranean and its legacy. So one of the first and most important things that comes out of this is the fact now that many Jews in Egypt, in Syria, in Asia Minor, become alienated from their native language. Well, alienated from Aramaic, we should say, which was kind of the global language of the Persian Empire. And so they need access to their scriptures in Greek. And we get the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which is very important for the early Christian mission, because the Septuagint, something completed by about 150 BC, probably begun about 250 BC, makes the scriptures of Israel immediately accessible to Gentiles throughout throughout the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And in fact, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible becomes the Bible of the early church for its first century before, New Testament documents really began to be shared widely. It also allows for the flow of Greek philosophical and ethical ideas throughout the Jewish diaspora of the Eastern Mediterranean. And this allows Jewish thinkers to kind of rebrand Judaism in a way that is appealing to Greco-Roman thinkers, to sort of reinterpret Judaism as a philosophy, as a kind of Greek philosophy, seeking some of the same ends. For example, the empowerment of virtue and the mastery of the passions and emotions. Think about Paul and the passions of the flesh that get in the way of a life of virtue. Think about the legacy of the Hellenization crisis. First, what happened in Jerusalem between 175 and 164 BC was a national trauma that would remain in Jewish consciousness for centuries to come. We encounter kind of reminiscences of this trauma when Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation in Mark 13, and when Paul talks about a man of lawlessness desecrating the temple of God in 2 Thessalonians. The Hellenization crisis brings with it a deep popular distrust of Gentile rule in Judea that was not present during the Persian or the Ptolemaic periods. We could get along with the Persians, but we're not sure anymore after having experienced what Antiochus IV did in Jerusalem. This, of course, positions Judea for disaster under Roman rule. With the martyrs of that period, there's the birth of the notion that voluntarily embracing death for the sake of obedience to God could have benefit for a disobedient nation, filling up the measure of God's wrath, turning God's wrath to mercy. If you hear in this echoes of what Paul will say about the death of Jesus, the death of the obedient one, and how that death reconciles the disobedient to God, you're hearing correctly. And it's probably out of the reflection on the martyrs of the Hellenization crisis that the seeds of early Christology are formed. There's also, for the first time, a clear articulation of the hope for resurrection from the dead as God's response to faithfulness in this life, particularly where faithfulness leads to death. If you were to read 2 Maccabees 7, you can find that in the Apocrypha, you would find probably the earliest clear articulation of this assurance, that the bodies we lay down for God out of obedience, he will give back to us in a resurrection unto life. So this hope that is central to the Christian confession really has its first clear soundings in this period. There are a number of things that the Maccabean Revolt leaves in Jewish consciousness that show up again in the New Testament period. Probably the most important of which is this concept of zeal for the law, zeal for the covenant, expressed violently, expressed in a manner of a watchdog, because Mattathias and his sons began as covenant watchdogs, putting the pressure first on Hellenizing Jews or Jews who are just afraid to continue to be faithful to the covenant because of the pressures around them. It became clear in the period after the Hellenizing crisis that Torah observance was a matter of national security, that if we give away Torah observance, the Gentiles will just destroy us, will ravage us. But if we keep Torah, just like God said all along from Deuteronomy 27, we would enjoy God's preservation and protection. So when Paul shows up on the scene, expressing zeal for the law by hounding fellow Jews who are not keeping as close to Torah as Paul thinks they ought for the sake of national security, we can probably better understand what is motivating him. It's not some psychological dysfunction in Paul. It's part of this legacy of Mattathias and his sons. We need all of us to be zealous for the law, and if you're not going to be, I will find new ways to motivate you. Also then, and this is actually very unfortunate, but the memory of a successful revolt against foreign domination and the successful reestablishment of an independent state remains firmly in Jewish consciousness after the Maccabean Revolt and after the fall of the Hasmonean Dynasty. This was to fuel a series of tragically unsuccessful revolutionary movements against Roman domination throughout the first century, many of which end up on multiple crosses, some of which end up with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple itself. I'm thinking there particularly of the revolt of 66 to 70 AD, which was a dismal failure, which was a shock to the Jewish system from which it barely recovered, but thanks to the enterprising work of the rabbis of Jamnia, it did recover. And of course, the establishment of Hanukkah, which annually keeps before the eyes of Jews the story that I've just told you today, the story of the Hellenizing crisis and God's raising up of the military saviors of the Hasmonean family, the Maccabean Revolt. If I might press you with 5 more minutes, the Hasmonean Dynasty, and that period also leaves an important legacy for us who read the New Testament. The first of which is the flourishing of the sects, the parties of Judaism that we encounter throughout the pages of the New Testament. Now, it's likely that the Pharisees and the Sadducees arose before the Hasmonean kings, but they really consolidated their identity and their boundary lines during the period of the early Hasmonean dynasty. And even though they collectively accounted for just a small percentage of the population, Pharisees and Sadducees would exercise disproportionate influence and at times power throughout the Hasmonean period into the Roman period. This was also the time that messianic expectations took off. Ironically, not during the Hellenizing Crisis, not during the Maccabean Revolt, but during the Hasmonean, the period of Hasmonean rule. And these messianic visions often included an implicit criticism of the Hasmonean rulers themselves. For example, the idea that the role of king and high priest should be joined in one person successively over generations was highly contested. And so the sectarians who lived at Qumran, who are famous for the Dead Sea Scrolls, looked forward to two messiahs, a priestly messiah and a kingly messiah, two different people in whom would be restored the right order of God's ordering of Israel, a king and a high priest. Or other sorts of messianic expectations that somehow, while they looked forward to God setting everything right, also included then the implicit criticism, not everything is right now under the Hasmoneans. The way they're administering the temple, the way they are exploiting their position, the way they are increasing quite dramatically the distance between the Jews with wealth and Jews without property and land and what have you. And of course, their last legacy is the loss of Jewish independence. Once again, short-lived political independence to Roman domination, which is then the state of affairs throughout the New Testament period and long after. So Odell, with those thoughts, I would end my presentation, except to urge our dear viewers out there not to take my word for it, but to read First Maccabees and read Second Maccabees and enter into this tumultuous period that had such lasting effect. Here's a good example. Think of the lingering effects of the Civil War on the United States. That is a really good analogy for the lingering effects of the Hellenization Crisis and Maccabean Revolt on Jewish consciousness, even 150, 200 years later. So dig into that literature because it really brings you closer to the pulse of the Jews that Jesus ministered to, out of the Judaism out of which the early church arose, than just sticking to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible on its own.
Thank you, Dr. deSilva. This has been a very rich conversation, filling in a lot of the gaps for those of us, or for those who have not read the apocryphal literature, particularly the First and Second Maccabees, which is what First Maccabees is more of the almost kingly report of what happened in terms of this Maccabean Revolt, the Hasmonean Dynasty, where Second Maccabees is more like the priestly report of the same time period. This is and then just I saw the parallels you were making when you said the lasting effects of the Civil War. This is good, but you're telling us that some of the things as a result of this Hellenization period is that we get the Hellenization of Judaism, which leads to the Septuagint. The Septuagint becomes the Bible, which is
the early church,
of the early church. The Greek Old Testament is what we would call it today. But it introduces, this is a time period where a lot of Greek philosophies and ethical, you mentioned, ideas are introduced. And this is what Paul was debating a lot in the New Testament. And so this is really the richness of the Apocrypha, because we sort of get this Gentile introduction in the New Testament, but we really don't, unless you've studied Greek philosophy, we don't really understand some of the things that Paul was fighting against. But it's during this period in the Apocrypha that these ideas are being introduced and how they were being received amongst the Jews.
not to be contrarian, Odell, but not just fighting against. Paul actually used some philosophical topics very positively, and not just Paul, but wherever you encounter topics about mastering the passions of the flesh in the New Testament. That's an early Christian seizing upon a popular Greek philosophical topic to say, hey, following Christ and walking by the Spirit will get you to that goal better, faster, more assuredly. But that is a goal that a Greek ethicist and Paul would share, so that the virtuous fruits of a good life, what Paul would call the fruit of the Spirit, but what Plato would call justice, courage, moderation, and wisdom, can take hold in a person's life. Sorry, Odell, just had to jump in on that.
No problem at all. No problem. But you also mentioned some of the conclusions that there was a zeal, just the zealous spirit. There was a zeal for the law, which led to the cleansing of the temple. And then also all of this, unfortunately, led to, some of the inner fighting that goes on, led to a loss of independence.
Yeah. The Hasmonean Dynasty became too much like the Hellenistic kingdoms that it had broken away from, more concerned with, various individuals more concerned with their own power rather than the well-being and the continued well-being of the state. The story of every empire's fall.
This is good. This is good. If you have not again read at least First and Second Maccabees, there's other good books in the Apocrypha, but it really does fill in a lot of the gaps particularly when in the Gospels, but some in the Gospels, mainly in the writings of the letters of Paul. It really does fill in a lot of the gaps. And so this is some very, very good literature that I highly recommend. What I'm going to do is allow Dr. David deSilva, who is a professor at Ashland Theological Seminary, the last word.
Well, I wasn't expecting that, Odell. Perhaps this. If you read beyond those two books in the Apocrypha, be alert to the many ways in which Jewish teachers were saying things that Jesus himself and other New Testament voices would value and incorporate into their own teaching. One of the great surprises that my own students have when we work through this literature together is to find Ben Sira saying in about 200 BC, how can you expect forgiveness from God if you don't forgive mortals who are like yourself? So a very deep root in Judaism for Jesus' teaching, or prayer, in fact, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. As you read of Wisdom of Solomon, talking about the figure of wisdom who is a reflection of the radiance of the Most High and the exact image of his goodness. Think about then what Paul and the author of Hebrews and John in the prologue of his gospel say about Jesus, and see how they're drawing on a rich tradition to find the raw materials to talk about the Son, Jesus, and to talk about what the Son was up to before the Word became flesh. And there's so many ways in which the literature of the Apocrypha that we tend to ignore informed the voices of the New Testament. They certainly did not ignore these texts, and so I'd say neither should we.
Thank you. We have been listening to Dr. David deSilva. He is the Trustees Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Greek at Ashland Theological Seminary, and he's been talking to us about the Hellenistic period of the Apocrypha and getting us to think about how much influence what we now call Greco-Roman culture played, particularly on the New Testament. Thank you, Dr. deSilva.
My pleasure, Adele. Thanks for having me today.